Hello and welcome to my channel. I went to lose gaming. So the 2.6 live stream just dropped and I do have some comments on that as well as a little bit of math to demonstrate which characters might see a bit of a buff. Now the first thing I want to talk about is definitely the new artifact set, the Vermilion Hereafter. To summarize, this artifact set's 2-piece provides 18% attack similar to the Gladiators as well as the Shimenawas, but the 4-piece set is what makes this thing interesting because when you use your burst it gives you 8% attack, and then every time you take damage, every 0.8 seconds, you gain 10% more attack. And once you have all 4 stacks up, that means that you will have 64% attack. Now 64% attack is quite a bit of attack, and it is an obvious artifact set catered for Xiao, but it's not quite all sunshines and rainbows, unfortunately. Now for a while I've been talking about how Xiao could use a bit of a buff, whether that's through artifacts or whether that's through a support character, and I'm going to be completely honest, this is arguably a buff for Xiao, but it's not going to be like a big buff for Xiao. And let's take a look at why that's the case. So first of all, if we take a look at this chart, we can see here that using Xiao's E's prior to his burst, you actually have a damage loss with the 4-piece Vermilion in comparison to the 2-piece Glad plus 2-piece Shimenawas. And if you've been using Xiao for a while, oftentimes those first 2 E's do a very large chunk of damage. Because you're sitting in Bennett's field, you have all your buffs up, then you use a couple E's to catch the particles and then use his burst. So unfortunately those E's prior to his burst actually do about 7% less damage. But next let's take a look at after you use your burst. Your very first plunge after using burst should do about the same amount of damage. And what about after roughly 3 seconds? When the 4 stacks kicks in for the Vermilion, you should do roughly 10 to 11% more damage. Yeah, it's a nice little buff to Xiao, which is good to see, but I also want to emphasize that usually when you use Xiao, you use a lot of attack buffing supports with him, like for example, you use Bennett, you use Thrilling Tales Sucrose. All these things actually dilute this buff, and unfortunately this will diminish the percentage gain in Xiao's damage by even more, right? So like it wouldn't be an 11% damage gain, it'd be something closer to like a 5 or 6% total damage gain. So with that in mind, it's up to you as a Xiao player to decide, is it worth dumping thousands of resin to try to get some artifacts here that can be as good as your current mixed artifact set? And do keep in mind that most of the time when you mix artifact sets like 2-piece Gladiators plus 2-piece Shimenawas, it creates a much better combination of substats than any 4-piece set that you might own. And this is because obviously having 4 pieces of really good stats and substats is going to be difficult in comparison to mixing and matching 2 of the best pieces from 2 different artifact sets. So after factoring in how good your substats might be, you're gonna have to spend thousands of resin, to say the least, to get roughly a 10% damage gain after 3 seconds of using your burst with Xiao, and that's only if it's only Xiao without any team buff. So do keep that in mind. You're gonna have to ask yourself if it's worth the resin to farm. Okay, so next let's talk about who else this thing can buff, and unfortunately it's pretty limited, and it's actually terrain based and enemy based. And what do I mean by that? Funnily, in the overworld, if you burn grass and you stand on it, then you can actually activate this buff pretty reliably. There's other scenarios, like for example, standing in electrocharged water with an armor with a character with super armor can also utilize this buff, as well as some other pretty more convoluted things that you can use to activate this buff. Yeah, so you guys have a rough idea, but honestly, the situations where you want to use and abuse terrain and burn some grass or and then, take damage intentionally because of that, yeah, it's not the most reliable, but it can open up some meme-worthy larger nukes that didn't exist prior. And I mean like very, very slightly larger nukes, not even like, hugely noticeable, but just a tiny bit more damage. Now, one more situation that this can be used against, and it's actually kind of a nerf to the enemies, is actually enemies with corrosion. Now, I'm assuming that corrosion applies, So when you're on field and you are affected by corrosion and you use your burst and you continue attacking, then you will actually benefit from this artifact set. But do keep in mind that that is another extremely situational thing. So outside of Xiao, who can actually use this thing unconditionally, essentially, because he always wants to use his burst and then do a bunch of plunge attacks. This is not an artifact set I recommend for any other character, even though you can burn grass and you can get affected by corrosion and then use that character. But yeah, too situational outside of Xiao. Okay, so next let's take a look at the Echoes of an Offering artifact set, and I guess I'll just read it real quick. The 2-piece set gives you 18% attack bonus, another 18% attack artifact set for 2 pieces. And finally, the 4-piece set bonus when normal attacks hit opponents, there is a 36% chance it will trigger Valley Right, which will increase normal attack damage by 70% of attack. This effect will be dispelled 0.05 seconds after a normal attack deals damage. If a normal attack fails to trigger Valley Right, the odds of it triggering next time will increase by 20%. This trigger can occur once every 0.2 seconds. Okay, so from what I'm reading here, basically what this does is this increases attack scaling DPS characters multipliers, skill multipliers essentially by 70%. So when we look at, let's say, a character that can use basic attacks, like why don't we take a look at Eula real quick? And when we take a look at her normal attack, we can see that her one hit damage does 164.9% damage. So what this would basically do is it would add 70% to this skill multiplier, because that's what the skill multiplier does, right? It basically multiplies your attack stat. And essentially, this really benefits characters that attack fast with low skill multipliers. For example, Yoimiya should be able to benefit pretty well from this because, most of her attacks have lower multipliers, like her N1, her N4. These also hit multiple times, so they are more likely to activate the passive. Now, in my opinion, and I think most people can infer this, this artifact set is mostly made for Kamisato Ayato. And my cat is playing with her ball toy right now, which she loves to do when I'm recording videos. This time though, I guess I'll just let her do it, so if you guys hear some silly noises in the background, you'll know what that is. We know that this artifact set is for Kamisato Ayato, but what about it being a buff for currently existing characters? Unfortunately, right now, I'm not going to do the math until we have more information on this artifact set, as well as, we can see how it functions in actual combat. And one huge question mark that I have is especially for Yoimiya. Now, Yoimiya, if this is treated like Yunjin's buff, where it adds flat damage, unfortunately, Yoimiya's elemental skill does not multiply Yunjin's added damage. So Yoimiya's elemental skill, you would assume, might multiply something like this, but unfortunately, until this thing is released and we're able to test it, we cannot make that assumption, and also we just don't know, like I said, until we test it. But one benefit that this does have is that Yoimiya can actually open fights with her burst instead of using her elemental skill and ending the rotation with her burst, like what she does with the Shimenaos currently. Anyway, we're going to have to wait until it's released to actually see if this is a buff for her. Now, as for other characters like Razor or even Eula or even Child, it's really hard to say because they currently have great artifact sets for them. So yeah, it's going to take some time for us to do some math for this artifact set in order to determine whether or not this thing is actually a buff for many existing characters. Okay, so next let's talk about Ayato. Now, Ayato looks to have a Hydro version of Ganyu's Burst, and Ganyu's Burst, as we know, is great for applying Cryo to a huge radius, although it's slightly RNG, but, overall it's pretty reliable. So, Ayato's Burst looks to be the Hydro version, which is going to be very, very great. Now, this will potentially set up some new Hydro combos because, new ways to apply Hydro and persistently as well is always going to open up new combinations and possibilities. Now, as of right now, it's too hard for me to predict exactly what combinations are going to be really powerful, but there does appear to be some things that stand out to me. One of which in particular is if it has similar targeting to Ganyu's Burst, in combination with Ganyu's Burst as well as Venti's Burst, monsters that get sucked together are going to have all the blades and all the icicles from Ayato's and Ganyu's Burst slamming into them in Venti's tornado, and they do AoE damage as well, hitting all of them all the time. That is going to be some ridiculous garbage mob dumpstering potential, like literally better than we've ever seen. Now, also interesting is that Ayato appears to buff normal attack damage. Now, I think the most obvious beneficiary from this is probably Yoimiya, right? They're kind of pushing this combo with, you're going to have some nice vapes here and there, whether it's Ayato or whether it's Yoimiya. And also Yoimiya's burst, Ayato can provide a lot of persistent off-field hydro damage, which is great for activating Yoimiya's burst. So yeah, I definitely do see the synergy here, and they mentioned how it appears to buff normal attack damage, so obviously that's going to buff Yoimiya's damage. The next thing is Ayato is likely to benefit strongly from Yunjin. It could be a nice buff for Yunjin as well, and also Yoimiya enjoys having Yunjin, so the two of them combined can really output some serious damage. And also finally, I honestly think this is a buff to Bennett again, because Ayato will be able to really benefit from Bennett as usual. So, we're going to see another character that will heavily enjoy using Bennett. Now, what other characters does Ayato bring up with him? I actually think that Xingqiu is another great character, as if he needed any help. He didn't, but, Xingqiu is another character that people will probably really enjoy pairing with Ayato. Xingqiu with some constellations provides Hydro resistant shred, which is amazing, and he also does a ton of damage, and Ayato also spamming normal attacks and basic attacks. He's going to have no issues activating Xingqiu's water swords. Okay, so the biggest winners for this patch are definitely, in my opinion, Xiao, but when I say Xiao, I mean it in the sense that it's actually a pretty small buff, and you're going to have to invest a ton of resin for a relatively minor buff for Xiao. Unfortunately, I am honestly a little disappointed by this. I was hoping to see something that would perhaps reduce Animo resistances for a main DPS character, or main Animo DPS character, because that's a multiplier that is severely lacking for Xiao, because you can always patch up Xiao's attack stat with things like Bennett and the Thrilling Tales and Tenacity, etc., right? There's plenty of options for buffing attack, but not a lot of options for Animo Shred. So anyway, that's okay though. It's nice to see a small buff to Xiao after all this time. I'm still hoping for a dedicated support for Xiao, but, I guess we'll see. Now, as for other character buffs, perhaps Yoimiya will see a nice little bump because of Ayato, as well as because of potentially the synergy with the Echoes of an Offering. And if Yoimiya can actually open up with her burst, that helps her a lot, especially with Ayato's Elemental Burst doing persistent damage to activate Yoimiya's burst damage. Now, Ayato as well should bring up Bennett's usage, which is ridiculous. I guess it's another buff to Bennett. Ayato's usage will also probably help Yunjin. In particular, Yunjin is interesting because not a lot of people actually use her right now, but I believe Ayato can really capitalize and maximize his abilities with Yunjin. And also, if you pair Ayato with Yoimiya and Yunjin, both of them can dump Yunjin stacks very quickly. So yeah, let me know what you think about my assessment of the biggest winners and losers. Overall, this is not going to change the meta tremendously. These two artifacts aren't nearly as impactful as previous artifact sets like the Emblem of Severed Fates or even the Husk of Opulent Dreams, which was a really nice buff for characters like Noelle and Albedo. So yeah, that's about it. What are you looking forward to the most in patch 2.6? Let me know down in the comments below. And let me know if you think I missed who is getting buffed or potentially even nerfed in the upcoming patch. Also, I regularly make Genshin Impact videos ranging from Caesar showcases, DPS showdowns, guide videos, and more. So be sure to smash the subscribe button, as it's the best and easiest way for you to support my work. Also, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.